Welcome to the Midlife Midsters Podcast, your podcast for inspiration on being bold and saying yes to making the most of midlife.
We're glad you joined us today. I'm Leslie Ann.
I'm Mary Ann.
I'm Carmen.
I'm Marla.
So I want to start with a little story about something that happened a number of years ago. And it was when my in-laws were elderly. My mother-in-law went into the hospital to have a knee replacement. And my sister-in-law flew out from Colorado so that she'd be there to take care of her when she was in recuperation. But while my mother-in-law was still in the hospital, my father-in-law took ill. And it ended up actually being his final illness. So here's my sister-in-law. She's there only for a few days to help my mother-in-law recuperate. My father-in-law's in the hospital, so she's trying to run back and forth to see him. And there was the dog. My in-laws had this huge golden retriever named McDuff, who was as beautiful as he was stupid. I mean, he was just the dumbest dog on earth. And I love dogs. We all love dogs, but we were all like, what the heck are we going to do with McDuff? It was clear that my mother-in-law was not going to be able to walk him for some time to come. My father-in-law wasn't going to be back in the house. My sister-in-law couldn't stay. And we were just all puzzling. And my husband and my sister-in-law were on the phone late into the night trying to figure out a plan for McDuff. Well, the next morning, my sister-in-law called and she said, McDuff just did the smartest thing he ever did in his life. He died.
Oh, no.
Under the dining room table.
Oh, no.
And so my husband... He knew. It was time. He realized that they had reached a point of transition.
Yeah.
Things were not going to be the same, and he just let it go.
Wow. Man's best friend.
Man's best friend. And so if you haven't figured it out, dear listeners, what we're going to be talking about today, it's that point when our parents suddenly begin to need us to parent them. And I think we've all been there or are all going through that. And I think there are some common themes that come from this difficult transition time. So I'm just wondering if anybody wants to share, like, what point did you realize, like McDuff did, that things were changing and the world around you was not going to be the same?
And I thought we were going to be talking about issues with our pets.
There's no issues with our parents.
Some ways as easy, some ways as difficult, right?
True.
In others, I just had a friend who dealt with her dog. There are things that I think we can do. It's sort of an interesting parallel in a way. Decisions that we can make in this country for our animals that we are not able to make for humans. So
True.
But anyway, that's a completely different topic. So ask the question again.
At what point did you realize, like McDuff did, that things were changing, that your parents were now not going to be the vital, active people that were, and that you were going to have to step in and parent them, at least to some extent?
I can start. I mean, I have a pretty complicated situation with a parent, a father who didn't really have a relationship for the last 20 years or so with any of his 4 children, which is its own set of complexities. But he reached a point, I saw him a couple years ago, where it's very funny because he's a retired physician, and this was kind of funny. My sister and I went to see him. We hadn't seen him in years at our childhood home. And there was a fair amount of chaos in the house because he couldn't really take care of himself. And he'd been getting lost and the neighbors had called us and such. So we went to see him and we're sitting on the back porch and he said, well, I have dementia. And I said, well, how do you know you have dementia? And he immediately turned into doctor speak. And I have an inability to recall words and confusion. And it was like he would just turn right back into a doctor. It was the funniest thing. So I had said to him, I'll come back if you need some help, but we really have to get your affairs in order. And he did not have powers of attorney. He had none of that stuff organized. So a few months later, I called to check on him, and he was in really bad shape. And he had declined a lot in like 3 months, which was kind of surprising. And so I said to him, I will come and do this, but if I come and do this, we really have to make real decisions about your finances and about your health care, which I'll spare you the details, but was a pretty taxing time. But we got it all done. And one of the things that and eventually he has pretty advanced dementia, so he's now in a memory care facility. But one of the things that I learned about it was you can't really parent your parents. They're not children. No matter how old they are, they're really not children. And Marla and I were talking about this before we started filming. One of the I see it today. My children don't always approve of the decisions that I make, and I'm still going to do what I'm going to do. And I don't think that's going to change between now and the time that I'm 89 like he is. So I think that's the hard part, is getting from your parents what they really want and then helping them figure out sometimes what they want and then helping them get what they want. But that's very complex, especially when they have mental decline. So that's been my personal experience with it.
I think it's challenging because sometimes what they want isn't realistic. Like when my mother was in her declining year, she had one really rough year and then died. But she wanted to stay in her house. That was like her primary goal, and that was just not going to happen. She was much too sick. The amount of care that she required was much too great, and it fell primarily on my sister, who lives there. I live here in Virginia. My sister lived up in New Jersey, to be the caregiver, and it was more than one person could do. Mm-hmm. And it was really hard to persuade her to go into. It was kind of an assisted living place. It was like a retirement home. She just didn't want to do it, but she did it, and not happily. And that was really, really tough. They can't always get what they want.
Yeah, we had the same problem with my father-in-law because his primary caregiver passed away, and he couldn't be left alone. He was in California, we were in Virginia, and my husband was the only remaining child. And so we had to have that tough conversation with him that he couldn't go home from rehab after he'd been sick. He had had a problem with his foot, and he actually passed away before he was not moving to Virginia. Like, it was not going to happen. And I really felt for him because I understand why he wanted to go home, and we really would have done anything that we could to keep him in his home. But it was, to your point, Leslie Ann, it was 3,000 miles away, and nobody lived in Los Angeles. So there was really no way to let him do that. Although he was very respectful of the conversation. So it's not like, it was a fight, but it was really sad and disappointing. And we kind of felt like we let him down, because we couldn't do what he wanted to do, but it wasn't feasible.
My parents have decided to age in place. So they're there. I'm one of four. I'm the one that's away. The other two sisters are about 2 hours away. My brother is close. And it has been interesting to watch them. My father's 91. My mother's now 79. My father gets on the computer. He pays his bills. He's able to really do a lot of those type of skills. But he is becoming frail, and he's having falls. And I think he always thought, my mom is 13 years younger, and she is a nurse practitioner, and she worked up until COVID. A couple days a week. She just absolutely loved it. And we always assumed she'll be the one that would be the caretaker for my father. And my mother seemed extremely strong as an individual. COVID hit. She became very isolated. And the emotional part of what is happening to my mother at this age has been very hard to watch. And I think our biggest struggle is that they want their autonomy, but yet they do need support. They don't realize they need support, but they do need support, especially my mother, because she does feel like she's kind of locked in there at the house having to take care of my father just because she doesn't want him to fall. I always thought that as my parents age, we would be able to get somebody in to help them with their daily living activities. In my mind, for some reason, when someone ages, that they need somebody to help and take them to the doctors, help them to do food. I never expected to be flying in as often as I do to scoop my mother up because of the emotions. So it's not the daily living. It is the emotional state that she feels and that she's in. So it really is a balancing act on the mental health piece of it, of her having to caregive. And as much as, and the losses that she's had over COVID, basically her social
environment. And my parents are pretty spunky. My mother's extremely adventurous, so she wants to still go out and do things, but he's unable to do that. So it is like rescuing my mother emotionally, and that has been probably the biggest challenge, watching them and us helping them as they age.
I think it's tough because you have two parents that are in different places in terms of what their needs are.
Right.
It's kind of hard to figure out how do you address that.
And let me tell you, their minds go a mile a minute like they're juveniles. I'll tell a story later, but I mean, the shenanigans those two are up to, like constantly, is unbelievable. You got to giggle and laugh and just hope they survive.
You know, and I think that's, I mean, very telling just of the four of us, and each of us can share stories or popping into your head of friends and their situations with their parents, that everything's different. Every single situation is different. My situation is different than any of yours. You know, my mom had Alzheimer's a number of years ago. My dad became her caregiver. We didn't parent him. We supported him. My brother did so much work because he's closer to where they are than I am, to help find caregivers. And then we kind of figured out who does what. So, you know, I ended up being the one that took care of the insurance and the billing and payroll. My brother was the one that was helping to interview and hire people to enable my parents to age in place, to respect the wishes, because my dad, although he's 4 months shy of 95, he's really still so incredibly together. So he's not looking for somebody to tell him what to do. He's looking for somebody to support him. And that's been a really important, I think, recognition for us. But the other thing, just the thinking about the caregiver piece, is that back, it's probably just about a year ago, I'm sure you guys all remember, my dad ended up going into the hospital for a few days. And my brother stayed at the house because my mom was there, and the caregivers are not overnight people. And then I went up and spent some time there and spent some time in the hospital and found myself, without even thinking about it, going into that, I don't want to call it parenting mode, but that take charge mode, where there was a nutritionist talking to the person in the room who shared a room with my dad. And I went out and talked to her afterwards and said, hey, how do we get a nutritionist? When the physical therapist came by, I left the room, talked with them. How do we get a physical therapist to come to the house? So even without consciously thinking about, is my role switching, I suddenly started doing those kinds of things that you might have done if your child was in the hospital, or you know what, if your friend was in the hospital. And so I think, again, some of it is, do we think about our roles changing? And maybe they change. Yes, of course they change, but they don't have to be a complete flip. And I think that's maybe what you were talking about. How do we support them in the way that works for everybody? Your mom needs something different than my mom needs. Right. Or your mom needs something different than my dad needs. My dad might need companionship. And so I go up there often and try to be a companion, not necessarily take care of the bills. My brother goes there and he does all that other stuff. I just try to go and have a good time.
Well, I think kind of what you're saying, especially like your last little phrase, is the once nurtured are now becoming the nurturers. And it is the circle of life. And that's exactly what we're all living in right now.
And I think we were raised differently, right? I mean, or at least we're raising our children differently maybe than we were raised. I placed a value with my kids on letting them be their own independent people. And it's easy to apply that as well in caring for parents, giving them as much latitude to have as much freedom still as they can, but still stepping in because they need structure, right? Somebody has to be there to talk to the doctor. Somebody has to make sure they're not, as my father-in-law did, unfortunately, signing up for lots of credit cards, right? So there's lots of points where you just have to guide them. But in a way, that's why I use the phrase parenting parents. It's not always taking over, but it's that fine tuned care
It is.
that gives, sees who they are and is a balanced approach to what they need. It's just that, we get to a point where we don't really want to be doing that, but we have to.
It's interesting because I don't think parents, well, at least my parents, I don't have any other parents, they don't feel like they actually need the help. Like they think that they got it. And, it's when I was just there a few weeks, or as you know, a couple of weeks ago, and it was just unbelievable. They were like, oh, let's sit outside, have a cup of coffee. And I just gotten there. It was in the morning. And my mom's like, okay, I need first you to fix my phone. I'm like, okay, I'll fix your phone. Did it. Okay, but I can't get into my laptop either. I forgot all my passwords. So then I did that. And then I've got an eye appointment. It might have been in April. April's come and gone. Can you do that? And then it went on. And then my father's like, I need you to do something. I'm like, that's unusual. You don't usually need me to do anything. And he slaps his phone on the table and he goes, I haven't been able to use it for weeks. And I pick it up and it's in safe mode. But at the end of the day, I was so exhausted. I was telling my sisters, if there is a professional tournament for the game of whack-a-mole, I am ready, because that's all it was. And when I was watching them through the day, just coming up with one thing after the other, I was like, this is like a bag of tricks. They just keep pulling things one after the other. Is it ever going to stop? Is that bag empty? Or are there these many problems that need to be handled today? But it's exactly what you do. But at the end of the day, they still thought they're doing a great job. And I guess they are in some ways, but they do need that support and they do need that nurturing. And I just hope they'll allow us to continue to give it without, them getting in any trouble in between.
So I give you a story that's similar about not thinking you need help, but needing help. Well, a few years before my mother died, she had open heart surgery. And when you have open heart surgery, because you did cardiac nursing, you're stitched, right? And you can't put any pressure. You can't pull, you can't lift, you can't lean. All you can really do, and you can't lie flat. So she was like totally cool. She was going to sit in her reclining chair with the remote control for the TV and the dog on her lap and be very happy that way. Well, I mean, it was a lot for my sister because everything my mother needed. Bring me this, bring me this, bring me this. So one day my sister was like, a few days into this recovery period, I just need a few hours to myself. And my mother was like, I'm fine. I've got this. And my sister was like, are you sure? I'm fine. I've got this. Go out. Go take time to yourself. So my sister went out. And she shut off her phone. Well, about 20 minutes or so after she left, my mother suddenly realized that she needed to go to the bathroom. And she looked and realized she couldn't pull herself out of the lounger. She couldn't pull on the lever. She couldn't lean over to get it. She couldn't get out of the chair. So she had the phone. She tried calling my sister. The phone was off. She tried calling a couple of other people. They didn't pick up. Her bowels were objecting to the fact that she was still sitting in the chair. So she called the police department. And the commercial, I've fallen, but I can't get up. Mm-hmm. My mother called the police department and said, I'm sitting and I can't get up. And they sent an officer to go get in her house. She told him where the key was sitting, to get in her house, to get her out of the lounge chair so she could go to the bathroom. And he waited for her to go to the bathroom, and then he put her back in her lounge chair and he left. So it's the unexpected things that they don't think they need, but they need.
Your sister will never turn off that phone again.
Never. I was about to say that officer had a good story at dinner that night.
Right? Yeah, nice neighborhood she lives in.
Well, it helped that my nephew was on the police department, so everyone knew my mother.
Yeah.
Sometimes they can just make us giggle and laugh too, which is a lot of fun. Finding the humor in it, even though there's a lot of times that you are sad, and it's hard to watch your parents, right, struggle in age, and it's hard for them to come to grasp with it as well.
I think that humor is important because that's the thing that you're going to remember. I mean, my mom's been gone 10 years, and what I remember are the funny stories now. I don't remember so much the more difficult parts of that last year.
Yeah, I was going to say, I haven't had any funny parts of dementia.
Dementia, I haven't either.
I have friends who did, and so I'm very conscious of the fact that I don't have those funny stories.
Yeah, same. Dementia and Alzheimer's are really, really ugly. Like they're really ugly. And there's not really, in my experience at least, to your point, Marla, there's nothing really very funny about it. And it just watch it, especially my father's in a memory care unit, and it's sort of prison-like, even though the nurses are wonderful and the medical assistants are wonderful. And these people are really called to their professions and they really care about the residents. But there's something about being locked in there that's just really, it's really tough, but there's really no other alternative because he couldn't.
Dementia is a hard piece of aging.
It's really bad.
When people can age and not have that, of course, that is what we all, for ourselves too, prefer.
Yeah.
For sure. But dementia is hard.
It's tough.
Then there's the flip side when your body starts to fail you and your mind doesn't.
Yeah.
Like you were talking about.
Right.
Where,
Oh, my father.
You can't move yourself. You can't go to the bathroom because you can't get there. You can't maybe feed yourself because you've lost mobility in your hands. So, yeah.
It's hard to watch. It's hard to watch. And it's, I think it's really a bittersweet thing too, because you see your parents really, I think, at least for me, in a much more human way. I mean, I always like to say when I was growing up, I looked at my parents and the adults of their generation, their siblings, kind of almost like gods and goddesses. Like they populated my world. There were a lot of them. My parents both had large families and they were always around and they were sort of, they could do no wrong, you know. And really when my parents my dad unfortunately didn't really get older, but my mother and my in-laws, I really started to see just more dimension in them as just whole human souls that had trials and tribulations and were going through this last part of life. My father-in-law embraced the fact that he was dying with such beauty and grace. It was just amazing. I still remember the last time we went to see him, and he was in that category. His brain was good, but his body just deteriorated. And he was amazing. He was very accepting and positive. And that to me was really an inspiration.
He had peace.
And he knew he was comfortable with the fact that life doesn't last forever, you know? I didn't see that in my mom. My mom resisted to the end, which was unfortunate.
I've seen that example in my uncle. I have an uncle who lives in the Shenandoah Valley who's 94 years old. And like my father, he's also a retired physician. And he is goals for getting old. Like the guy is just amazing. And not because he does anything particularly amazing. I think what's just really cool about him is that he accepts that death is a part of life and he wants to live his life as well as he can for as long as he can. I do have a couple of cute stories about him. His wife is about 12 years younger. It's his second wife. My aunt died like 25 years ago and he remarried. She's a really delightful woman. And one day he comes and he says to her, "Soon I'm not going to be able to walk." And he knows the signs of aging, both from himself and also from being he was a general practitioner physician for years and years and years and years, for like 55 years. And so my aunt says, "Well, I don't think you're going to like that. And I'm sure not going to like that." So they go to the doctor and the doctor prescribes basically physical therapy, but them going to the gym. So here's my uncle. They go to the gym. He starts doing basically squats, getting up and down out of a chair and some other things. And he told me later, he said, and he would only go if my aunt went with him. And she said, actually, it's been great for both of us because both of us have been in better health as a result. And the other thing he told me was that he was very surprised by the cognitive gains that he got by going to the gym. And they go to the gym 3 times a week for half an hour. And it's mostly like functional fitness, but at 94 years old, they still go. And he says it's been great. I asked him not long ago, I said, "How is getting older? Is it getting to be a drag?" And he goes, "The only thing I really hate is the short-term memory loss." He said that was very irritating, but he gets up every morning, he puts his clothes on, he goes and sits by the pool, he has breakfast, he has lunch, he enjoys the birds. And I mean, it's a beautiful way to live. And I keep thinking to myself, that's how I want to be if I'm lucky enough to make it that long.
Did he always live a healthy lifestyle like that?
He did. Well, no, he was actually a 30-year smoker. There's a lot of longevity on my father's side of the family. 3 of the brothers were 30-year smokers and all lived over the age of 92, which is just genetic freak. But he was always a very calm, realistic and calm person, realistic and yet optimistic. And he saw some tough things in his life, but he just I don't know. He just always was and he was also very mission oriented. He loved his work. Once he retired from being a doctor, he actually volunteered at the free clinic for like 5 years. So I think he had a calling, and he had a deep spiritual life, and he's just, he's kind of goals for how to live.
And I don't know that generation, the majority of people were like that. Looking at
he's unusual.
Our generation, there's so much knowledge out there. If we do keep ourselves healthy and we do keep our minds stimulated, we actually basically extend our midlife for a lot longer. So when we get old, it might be like 80 or 90 where that real elderly kind of piece falls in. And it's kind of like what he did. He's still doing things, he's just kind of hit old age, if you want to call it that. But a lot of knowledge, I think, is gained now that maybe wasn't available earlier. So hopefully we'll all be able to experience something like that in the future.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why I do my Duolingo to keep my brain active. Try to get my 10,000 steps every day to get my body active.
I deliberately live that way.
Yeah.
Try to. I think we all do at this table. We do. We absolutely all do.
Yep.
I have a question for you. You mentioned that your dad had a difficult relationship with his 4 children. And I know your mom, who's just delightful, and you have a fantastic relationship with your mom. How did you prepare yourself, or what did you say to yourself to be able to be in a position where you could give care and attention to your dad? I mean, was it difficult because the relationship was a difficult one?
It's very difficult, and probably get emotional talking about it, but it was really something I had to do for myself. I thought long and hard about, what will I think of myself 20 years from now if I didn't do anything? And I decided that wasn't really something I could live with. I also just felt I don't have a close relationship with him. I still don't have a close relationship with him. But I also thought, how should any elderly person be treated? Like the person on the street? And I would not wish dementia or Alzheimer's on anyone. And so I thought to myself, I really don't want to be in a position to treat him worse than I would a person. I mean, not that I'm picking people up off the street, but everybody kind of deserves some dignity in their older years. So that's kind of how I got my head around it. I won't pretend like it's not hard, and I won't pretend that I don't have moments of anger or bitterness about it, when I would rather be paying attention to my children or my husband or my mom, or even frankly my stepdad, who I'm very close to, and his wife. But I'm also confident that it was the right thing to do. And it speaks to my faith. It's like, do unto others as you'd have done unto you. And it's not very fun. Like, I don't enjoy it. It will not be like how when my mom gets old, I will do it with, pleasure is not the right word, but I'll be happy to do it, right? And I was happy to do it with my in-laws. I didn't have too much responsibility around that, but I was very happy to support my father-in-law as he was declining. I don't feel that way about my father. So yeah, it's tough. And it's not too personal. And I'm glad I said that because I think there are a number of people in my position, and it's a really difficult thing to do. Mm-hmm.
Right. And some people choose not to.
Yeah, which I actually think is an okay choice. It just wasn't my choice.
My choice.
Right.
Yeah.
It took a lot of compassion.
Yeah, Marianne had to hear the bitterness, though.
Yeah, no, but it did. It did.
We had an interesting circumstance in our care for my mother at the end. And when I say our, I primarily mean my sister and I, because we were the two that were mostly responsible for taking care of her. My mother had taken in her mother. So when I was a little girl, my grandmother came to live with us, and she had suffered several strokes. She had dementia. She only spoke Italian, and no one in the house spoke Italian. So she couldn't communicate with anyone. And to make that even worse, when my grandmother came to live with us, she had been in the hospital for surgery. And while she was in the hospital, my grandfather died. And they closed up the house and put all her things in storage and moved her to our house. So she was completely bewildered and didn't know where she was or what was happening. And she required a tremendous amount of care. And, I was a kid. I think I was 9, maybe 8 or 9 when she moved in, and she lived until I was like 20. So for many, many years, my mother cared for her. And it was physically and emotionally an enormous drain on my mother, and really on the rest of us too. And I always said to myself, I won't do that. I will not do that. I wouldn't do it to my family. I wouldn't do it to myself. But then you're in a different position when it actually is a decision that you have to make. And so, when we made the decision that my mother really needed to sell the house and move, that was in the back of all of our minds. Like, how do you balance? Like, we knew what we were looking at if we tried to keep her home. But by the same token, she so wanted to be home. So you really had to set aside our sort of preconceived notions about like what we're going to do and what we're not going to do, and look afresh at the situation. And that was actually really complicated because my kids were older, so that was good. But it really would have fallen on my sister, and the amount of care that my mother needed, seeing what the amount of care my grandmother needed had done to my mother, that just wasn't, it was just too much.
And sometimes it's a financial reality for people.
Yes,
like some people have to take in loved ones because that's their financial reality. And that's, I think, difficult. We were lucky enough that my father could be put into an assisted living facility that was good for him and he could afford it and such. But I think that becomes, care is, as you all know, extremely expensive.
It's ridiculous.
Shockingly
expensive.
expensive.
Yeah. Are there any happy stories from Karen? You have funny stories.
I do.
I do. I have a happy story. I think one of the things that happened as my father-in-law was declining, and then as my father declined, y'all know my mom. My mom's in her late 70s, but she is actually finally retiring, but she's very vigorous. I do think one of the cool things about her seeing me handle these situations, one as a daughter-in-law and one as a daughter, is that now she and I are having like really amazing conversations about what she wants older age to look like. And I have to put a plug in for this book. I think this book is amazing. He's a physician. I think he's out of Harvard. I think it's Harvard, named Atul Gawande, who wrote a book called Being Mortal. And it's a really beautifully written guide for how to have conversations with your parents about, or other loved ones, about what they would like their lives to look like as they get older and how you can help them figure that out and help them live the way that they want to. So my mom and I actually talk a lot about that. Like, how will she be cared for? I mean, she has a retirement, but like, how will I help her financially stay organized? And, where will we live? We don't live near each other right now. What's that going to look like? We don't have any resolution on it, but it's very nice to be having a proactive conversation about that versus sort of the emergency reactive conversations that we had to have with both my father-in-law and my father. So I hope we continue in that vein and can make some good moves before it gets dire. Mm-hmm. And that it's very much a relief to me to be able to talk openly about that.
I think that's such a great notion and takeaway. We were talking about this the other day about like being proactive, but looking at, are there consultants? Are there people who, there are financial consultants to look at your retirement savings, but who's telling us, right? Who's telling us how to manage this time and these transitions? What books should we be reading? What kind, and again, like thinking about, wow, right? Talk about this when you're 60 or 70, right? So that you can think about how to address those ages and how you want to be with your family or where you want to be, and not end up in those situations where, okay, now what do we do because mom, dad can't take care of themselves? And I think really kind of a takeaway is even for us, right?
Absolutely.
How do we want to be thinking about that? Just a slight aside, I was thinking a lot about my situation as a parent whose children had to help provide care when I had my surgery. And that was the first time where suddenly the situation was flipped. And my kids were taking care of me. I mean, some of my friends were as well. But in the house, you need to come. Like my daughter came down and stayed with me when I was having my surgery because I wasn't able to take care of myself then. And even how do we navigate those conversations? And I don't even think I navigated them. I don't know. I'll have to ask her. I think we just like, oh, yeah.
They probably just showed up for you.
Right. But really thinking about how was I able to accept that and it actually be a positive experience for all of us.
You know, we're talking about care. My youngest son, probably a year ago, maybe a little bit longer than that. It must have been something you found on Instagram or TikTok. I don't know what it was, but it's 10 questions that you should ask your mother before she dies.
Oh, really?
And like there were questions like, Mom, what's your favorite memory of me? Mom, what was it like to be pregnant with me? What was your biggest challenges? It was, Mom, what was the dream that you were able to live that you always wanted to? And I just thought it was so beautiful. And those are questions actually at our age we could be asking our parents as well. But you were talking about your kids. They just showed up. I think they think differently too. Like they're just there for us. And my son wanted to know answers to these questions. And I'm not that old yet, but I thought it was a good.
Love that.
It's funny you say that because for Christmas, my daughter-in-law, my new daughter-in-law, because my son just got married, gave us a game. And it's like a trivia game, but you pull it and it's questions. And they're questions for my husband and I to answer about different stages of our life so that they can get to know more deeply who we are, which I just think is really cool. So I'll leave one last thought. And it's this. It's a story I'm going to share from a friend whose father actually had dementia, lived in upstate New York. She was in a position where she was having to go up pretty frequently to look after him. And she decided to do something to turn the experience into a little bit more positive than just going up and, being with her dad alone. She started inviting all of the neighbors to cocktails on the patio on Friday nights in the summer. And it was partly for her dad so that he would see the neighbors and feel people around him and still feel connected, even though he was, not really all there. But in the end, it ended up being for her. And it helped support her and nurture her as she was nurturing him. And after he passed, she still goes up there and still has cocktail parties with the neighbors.
It's wonderful.
And so I think that the tip I would take from that is remember if you're caring for someone else to care for yourself as well. And to do things to bring a little bit of light and joy into what is a very, very difficult time. So we thank you for listening to today's podcast. You can follow us at AmericanMinsters.com. Please log in and send us any ideas you have for other episodes or topics that you'd like us to discuss.